Hello everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. When we last left the King and Queen, they were on their way to Canada and the United States, on a journey that got a bit scary with icebergs all around. Speaking of scary, Hitler was making Europe nervous, and the war seemed to be at hand. King George VI wasn't sure that he should leave the country, but the government said it was a necessary trip to make sure Canada and the United States could help England out when the time came. So let's see what happens next. Queen Elizabeth wrote to Queen Mary that the foghorn echoed off the icebergs like the twang of a piece of wire, incredibly eerie. We very nearly hit a berg the day before yesterday, and the poor captain was nearly demented because of some kind of cheerful people that kept reminding him that it was about here that the Titanic was struck, and just about the same date. So that couldn't have been comforting to hear about that. And the fog finally cleared up on May the 14th. Tommy Lascelles, the King's acting private secretary for the trip, stated if the trip had been delayed any longer, it would have really messed up the schedule. The trip to Ottawa from 4 days to 2.5, and then he said they mosaicked the first 4 days so that nothing was left out. The silver lining was that it gave the King more time to rest. On May 17th, they made it to Wolfe's Cove, where the royal party was to disembark. The cliffs above the harbor were lined with thousands of spectators who had been gathering since early morning. At 10:30 a.m., Prime Minister Mackenzie King and Justice Minister Ernest Lapointe went on board to welcome the King and Queen. According to Mackenzie King's diary, it showed that the Queen was aware of the personal contribution she could make to the success of the tour as a Scottish Queen. She spoke of Scotland's link with France and the number of Scots who had come to Canada. Nor were Canadian Scots about to forget this. A few minutes later, the King and Queen went ashore. The King was wearing the full-dress uniform of an admiral of the fleet, and the Queen was elegant in a pale gray dress of light wool with long slit sleeves edged with fur and a hat with a becomingly upswept brim. The Queen stepped off first and said that this was the first time she had set foot on Canadian soil, and it was the King's second visit. He had been to Canada as a naval cadet in 1913. After they were presented with a long line of dignitaries, they were driven to the Quebec Parliament to receive provincial and municipal addresses. Both the luncheon which followed and the dinner that night were held at Chateau Frontenac in the Canadian Pacific Railway Hotel. The lavish luncheon was followed by a speech by Mackenzie King, expressing pride that Canada had been chosen for the King's visit to his dominions and stressing that the King and Queen had come ashore at the same spot as the French founders of Canada. The King was a bit nervous in his reply, beginning in English and ending in French, and it was well received, though. One of the Canadian officials said that when the King began to speak, he was certainly moved and it was a little difficult to understand him, but he quickly recovered himself and continued his address in a firm voice, and he was warmly applauded. After lunch, the King and Queen drove round the city to a warm, quiet welcome. They spent the night at the Citadel, the Governor of General's Quebec residence. The first 24 hours had been a success. When asked what the impression the King and Queen had made in Quebec and whether French Canadians were loyal to England, it was said that less than 5% of the French Canadian population shared the anti-British feelings expressed by certain soapbox orators, and it was a great thing to see for the people to see the King. And now they felt he belonged to them as King of Canada. At Quebec, the King and Queen went by train for the rest of the tour, covering 9,510 miles in 29 days. It was the Governor General's official train, and it had been redecorated and extended to 12 carriages to carry the large party. The 2 royal carriages were painted in silver and blue, and the royal arms put on each. And then the bedrooms were furnished in gray blue and pink for the Queen and blue and white for the King. There was a wood-paneled office for the King, sitting rooms and a handsome dining room, and pull-down maps on rollers to follow their route across Canada. And there was a carriage for the Prime Minister who accompanied them throughout the tour. The train was comfortable and luxurious, but there was hardly enough room for the Queen's clothes. But she needed a large wardrobe for the multiple occasions and the climate changes ahead. One accompanying journalist stated that she had made 48 appearances in 32 different outfits. There was a royal staff of 19, including 3 British police officers, and at the King's special request, there were 4 Royal Canadian Mounted Police orderlies in the party, and there was to be bodyguards if the crowd got over enthusiastic, and 8 more Mounties traveled with the train. They got to Montreal in the early afternoon of May 18th. The welcome was as warm as in Quebec City, but noisier. The private secretary reported that there was a splendid crowd, and he said, "We must have seen well over 1 million people in Montreal alone." Montreal had been planning for the visit for months, and the arrangements were lavish. The street decorations alone cost hundreds and thousands of dollars. Houses were painted and balconies rented out to spectators. When the king and queen arrived, they had school children in the East Baseball Park to sing the national anthem, but they started cheering instead. Their host in Montreal was the mayor, Million Hood, and he was entranced by the queen. The city of Montreal gave a dinner, and the queen wore a close-fitting silver-blue brocade gown embroidered with silver sequins and rhinestones, and a diamond tiara, 3-strand necklace, and earrings. And the dinner was 6 courses and vintage champagne. The Quatuor Alouette sang traditional French-Canadian folk songs, as well as Scottish, Irish, and English tunes. The next morning, May 19th, the royal train arrived in Ottawa, and they were greeted by Lord and Lady Tweedsmuir. The city was filled with spectators who had come in from the surrounding countryside, and thousands of Americans were there too. The first day in Ottawa was to have a session of Parliament, and the king was to preside over it. The queen wore crinolines and a large golden train. The private secretary said the queen is looking radiantly beautiful and has them all gasping like goldfish, particularly the American pressmen. Saturday, May 20th, was designated for the king's birthday, since he would be in the United States on his official birthday of June the 8th. To mark the day, Trooping the Colour was held on Parliament Hill. The king saluted, and the queen watched from a window with Lord Tweedsmuir. When the crowd saw her, he said nothing would induce several thousands of them to look at the trooping. They simply kept their eyes glued on Her Majesty and shouted like dervishes. The Canadian government had been anxious for her to perform a ceremony to commemorate her visit, so after the trooping she laid the foundation stone of the Supreme Court building. She made a speech, and she spoke in French, and she pointed out that the Scottish and French-Canadian law shared their source in Roman law. The Queen had an instinct for the unexpected, and she asked Lord Tweedsmuir to take her and the king to meet the mason working on the building. Some of them were Scots, and they spent at least 10 minutes in Scottish reminiscences in full view of 70,000 people who went mad. The following day, in beautiful weather, the king unveiled the National War Memorial, and then Tweedsmuir reported an extraordinary thing happened. The king and queen and Lord Tweedsmuir and his wife were in a crowd of 6,000 or 7,000 ex-soldiers and kept the most perfect order among themselves and opened up lanes for their majesties to pass through. There was no need for police. The second day in Ottawa, there was a garden party at Government House, and there were cheering guests. The king and queen appeared on the balcony to acknowledge the cheers of the crowd. There was about 100,000 in the central square. Rufus Polk, one of the senators, said to the queen, "Ma'am, I would fight for you. Yes, I would fight for you until hell is frozen." Then it was on to Toronto. The king and queen waved to the crowds from the rear platform of the train as it ran slowly through the towns. This was often repeated as they traveled west. In Toronto the next day there was a welcoming ceremonies. The Queen accepted the colonist-in-chief of the Scottish Regiment in 1937. She inspected her regiment and presented them with new colors, and she made a short speech alluding to the ties uniting Canada and her native Scotland. She met with Sir William Mullock, a distinguished Canadian elder statesman, and he gave her funds collected by the Black Watch in Toronto to endow beds at a Black Watch home in Scotland. She also asked to meet in Toronto the president of the Canadian Mothercraft Society. The final engagement was the Woodbine Spring Meeting, and they were invited at the suggestion of the president of the Ontario Jockey Club. They watched the King's Plate, and this started the Queen loving horse racing. Queen Elizabeth wrote to Princess Elizabeth that they were so busy in Ottawa that she never had a chance to write her, and she was on the train, and this was her first opportunity. She wrote, "All day we have been passing through lovely wild country, rather like Scotland on a large scale." She said that Papa and I have had a wonderful welcome everywhere we've been. The French people in Quebec and Ottawa were wonderfully loyal, and in Montreal there must have been 2 million people, all very enthusiastic. Papa and I are bearing up very well. Though we are working very hard from morning to night, we go in open cars, and the good air keeps us well. The train stops at little stations to get water or coal or ice, and there's always a crowd, and we go out and talk to the people. Yesterday there were some Indians with a baby in a wooden cradle, and always someone from Scotland, usually Fofar or Glams. When they got to Winnipeg on May 24th, it was raining, but the King and the Queen kept their car open for their drive around the city, and they were cheered by large crowds, and it included many Americans. Later in the evening, the train made its customary stop at a small station for the night. The Queen had a chance to write to Princess Elizabeth again, and she said, "We spent the night in Winnipeg, a large town where all the business is done for thousands of miles of farms around it. It rained in the morning but cleared up in the afternoon when we drove 28 miles with cheering people and children all the way." May 25th, they got to Saskatchewan, and the crowd was boisterous there, too. They had a state dinner at Regina, government's house. In Calgary, Queen Elizabeth wrote to Princess Elizabeth, "We saw a lot of Indians and quite a lot of cowboys on bucking broncos who came dashing after us. They made an unscheduled stop at an Indian encampment on their drive through the city, and they shook hands with Duck Chief Head. He was head of the Blackfoot tribe." At a hotel they were staying at, Queen Elizabeth wrote to Princess Elizabeth that it was boiling like all Canadian houses. "We opened all the windows and expected all the poor inhabitants will get pneumonia. This morning we climbed a mountain nearby which took about 50 minutes. It was very like Balmoral, only much bigger, and the pine trees smelt delicious in the hot sun. This afternoon Papa and I went for a buggy ride." And they watched a moose feeding on water lily bulbs and beavers building a dam, and also saw black bears and other animals. The Queen wrote that it was a relief to get away from the roaring crowds and the incessant noise, even though one is glad that the people are pleased to see us. And the Queen felt that they were bearing up well, and added the next 2 weeks would be tiring but worthwhile work. She felt it was important for the people to see their king and not have him only as a symbol. The king was pleased with the trip, but became uneasy as they traveled even further from Europe. He was glad Hitler and Mussolini weren't up to anything, but felt that they might blow up again at any time, and he longed for the visit to be over with and to be back home again. When they got to Vancouver on May 29th, they were praised once more for their spontaneity, and they made extra stops and talked to the people that weren't on the plans. This was a skill the Queen had easily, and the King acquired it under her influence. One guest said, "She dazzled me. As she greets you, she seems as though she actually would like to know you." When they boarded the SS Princess Marguerite, passing through a formation of Indian war canoes at Lionsgate, the captain said, "She's the most charming woman in the world." May 30th, there were formal municipal and provincial welcome ceremonies, and they took photographs and then had a state luncheon. The King made an eloquent speech referring to Victoria as Canada's Western Gateway and to Canada's role, looking as she did both east and west, in furthering friendly relations between the two hemispheres. A reporter watched the Queen as the King spoke and said that she became tense and serious as he spoke. Her eyes never left his face while he exchanged glances with her at the beginning and end of the speech. Then she relaxed. Edmonton was the last provincial capital on the tour, and the streets were crowded once more. The King and Queen made unscheduled stops to receive presents of beaded white buckskin from a group of Cree Indians, and then to the University Hospital to talk to disabled ex-servicemen and child patients whose beds had been brought outside. One veteran told a reporter that both the King and Queen had shaken hands with him as they walked along the beds. Another paid her a compliment and was rewarded with a smiling word of thanks. And did she smile? Oh boy, $1 million worth, that's all. I'll never forget it, the soldier said. June 6th, they made a brief stop at Windsor, Ontario, and 500,000 people showed up. There were a lot of Americans in the crowd, and they had been crossing the border at a rate of 30,000 an hour, and had come to greet them. That day was really warm, and the King was feeling the heat in his heavy uniform of a field marshal, and the Queen raised one of her parasols. They then drove from St. Catharines to Niagara. The American part of their journey was about to begin. At 9:30 p.m., the royal train left Niagara Falls. 5 minutes later, at the end of the suspension bridge, the Canadian officials, except the Prime Minister and his staff, stepped off, and the program read that at this point, the responsibility for the royal train will be accepted by the United States. But the Queen, with the King's support, insisted on keeping the Mounties with him. In a dingy brick border station in a decrepit neighborhood of Niagara Falls, the U.S. Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, and a welcoming committee greeted the King and Queen. It was an historic moment, the first visit by a reigning British monarch in the United States. So I will end the video here with the King and Queen making it to America. The Canadian trip was an exciting adventure. They had so much to do in a limited amount of time. Canada is such a large country, and it was amazing to see how much the King and Queen accomplished during the time allotted. The King and Queen got to see the people of Canada and those Americans who crossed the border to see them too. It made me tired just to see all they accomplished while they were there in Canada. The King and Queen really thrilled the crowds, and the King got his ease of meeting the crowds from his wife. It sounded like the Queen made a very big impression wherever she went. She had charm to spare. I can't wait to see how they do in America. It should be very interesting. I hope everyone enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would really help me out and help the channel out. I wish everyone a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.